Third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch.
The Apophis Asteroid Apocalypse Episode 22, War, by J.M. Conradi. All characters and events are fictional and futuristic. Any similarity to today is entirely coincidental. Guest readers for this video, Barbara Trollip and Modrid Mcthrib. War came suddenly, and without much warning, to the hidden mountain reserve community in a faraway country. If they had not been preparing for more than 4 months, due to the so-called neurotic worries of Ian, they would have been just another survival story hitting a dead end, within the first year of the apocalypse. Even by night, gunshots had become very scarce. They guessed that the fights for supremacy, between herds of crazed masses in the valleys below, had been settled and small enclaves of survivors all vanquished or, even worse, eaten. It was late September, a harsh winter slightly abating, almost 6 months after Apophis had landed. Famine, war, sickness, and the total collapse of civilization in that area, had wreaked 1,000 times more harm than any 370-meter asteroid could. After the only inhabited army camp in the area had fallen, probably overrun by hundreds of thousands of hungry, angry people, ammunition and therefore gunshots could be heard almost every night. But careless wasting of such resources always met a swift end after a few days. There was a lot more silence then, and it was a lot more ominous. Their raiders, seconding as scouts, reported that a more organized harvesting of resources was going on in the distance, and movement seemed to be methodical. First the movement seemed to focus southward, but then it turned north and it was getting closer. There were slim pickings left in the area, either the remaining warlord of, they guessed, the cannibals was desperate, or had realized the rural areas to the far north were the best option. But to get there, they would have to pass through the neck in their mountain, on the main road. The only remaining local shortwave radio noise was to the north, as Marius reported. If the main herd moved there, all those survivors would be lost. Charlie said that war was not something he wished for, but thousands and thousands of cannibals moving past them, without becoming interested in their lush, fenced reserve, was highly unlikely, and therefore probably catastrophic. Therefore, they had been preparing for the possibility, booby-trapping the road, building a plan with barriers. If war came up the main road, they would set in motion what Ian called, the Ethelflaed trap. She was a Saxon queen who conquered a Viking army at Chester more than 1,000 years ago, using fake barriers. And he prayed they would never have to use her plan, because that would mean the fight of their lives. Suddenly their main raiding party reported contact. The enemy seemed to have no working guns, but their numbers were too big. "We are cut off from the overnight decoy camp, we are heading home, and we may be pursued," came the desperate radio call. Without first asking permission, Ion rushed on horseback to the southern gate, and locked it with his own lock. Before the guards, who trusted him, could even ask questions, he was off to the narrow pedestrian gate on the main road, where barrier builders entered. It was already locked as always, but he double-locked it. That gate once led to a pedestrian bridge, but they had destroyed part of it for security. Then he radioed the main road barrier and the northern gate to tell them to be on the lookout for their own raiding party. To shock and utter disbelief, he radioed the raiding party that they would have to move around the reserve, only the northern gate will be opened. He just cut off their complaints and repeated, you will lose your only chance to safety if you come to the closest gate. You must go around, and go fast. You broke the rule about gunshots this close, and it is almost certain that you are being followed." Only then did he go to face Charlie and the council, and gave them his keys. Though angry, they realized there was no time to argue. War was upon them. Operation Ethelflaed was set in motion. Their own raiding party was now the bait, leading the enemy up the main road and through the neck in the mountain. On the other side of the main road was another high fence, a monument site with some wildlife, which they had long since harvested or moved to a hidden camp. Though enticing, that side of the mountain was not feasible for a hidden community. Its only use was the high fence, which made the main road like a fenced-in trap. The raiding party came through the neck fast. They were slowly pursued by some men on bicycles, leading a war party. In the distance though, a low rumbling could be heard. Binoculars soon proved that this was no scouting party, this was the vanguard of the herd. Once their own raiding party was through, Charlie and his men moved a flimsy-looking barrier across the road. From behind it, crossbows and a few guns easily obliterated the pursuers without much damage. What was important, they knew, was for nobody to see past the bend in the road, and escape to warn the herd. Because just around the bend, invisible from below, was the main barrier, a massive construction built like a fort with a narrow steel gate. That main road barrier gate was locked, the moment their own raiding party had passed through. The road between the barriers was the slaughtering field, where their considerable, by now, inventory of booby traps, fertilizer pipe bombs, and other weapons of mass destruction, were focused. Everyone stayed carefully hidden, so as to not pique any interest in the rest of the mountain reserve. Just in case, they spared some precious manpower, including Biff, to patrol the part that did not border the main road. Such a large attacking force may well have stragglers or spies trying different routes. All the non-combatants, mostly older women and small children, were hidden together in the camouflaged mess tent. There were some tense moments of debate, as usual, to these orders, and trying to round everyone up quietly, until they noticed the sound and sight of thousands upon thousands of mad cannibals. What else could they be, after 6 months of economic collapse in a very densely populated state with scant natural resources? The main body of the herd arrived at the bottom part of the road through the neck, saw the flimsy barrier at the top, and charged, shouting at best obscenities, at worst shouting that sounded like animal sounds. There was little time to observe them, but they did not look well. The wounds and burns of the apocalypse seemed permanent, and months of living in the worst way possible showed in their eyes. They were also sluggish and off-color, possibly because of a diet that was never meant for humans. But they were formidable because of their numbers, and because they were used to winning. Slightly to the back appeared the reason for their conquering of all before them, an intimidating man standing on an antique truck, fitted with crude armor plates. He was surrounded by a madly overdressed guard platoon on horseback. The truck still had wood fittings in the cockpit and around the side. Ian smiled inwardly. Many of them wore flammable clothes and weapons. From his hiding place, he could only see 4 guns with magazines. All the other guns had knives tied to their barrels, like hand weapons. A few hundred of the herd were killed while dismantling the small barrier, with thousands of attackers catching up with the front of the army, bundling behind them. A few pipe bombs were used by Charlie, but mostly to draw attention and make noise while killing some warriors. In those few minutes, far down at the bottom of the hill, behind the last of the army who had caught up with the rest, a truck pulled another barrier across the road, locking the herd in, just when they broke through the minor barrier and charged around the bend in the road. Shouts of victory changed to screams of dismay when they saw the main barrier across the road around the bend. It was impossible to count how many people were now boxed in on a 2-mile stretch of road, but it was thousands. Being arrogant as the victors of all the little wars of the past few months in the valleys, the herd and their leader did not panic. Instead of turning around, they thought they could make short order of the main barrier too, by bringing their truck, all the time guzzling very scarce gas, to the front. It had a heavy bull bar at the front, and what seemed like a mechanized storm ram. They were going to win this by sheer force, like they had won everything to date. Bringing the truck through was difficult, because of the way their army had been bundled into the trap, during the half-hour it had taken to conquer the small barrier. Their leader shouted orders, and they began looking for weak places in the fence, through which to move some of their number, to make way for the truck and horses. What looked like the weakest accessible parts of the fence, all led to a large and impenetrable thorny thicket on the inside. Trying to find a way through, inevitably funneled everyone to a gap of about 8 meters across, from where a gravel road led up the mountain, to the various parts of their community. This is where patrols traveled from the top every day, to check the fence on this side of the mountain, because the fence was mostly behind the thicket, if approached from the inside. There was logically just one defensible place, if the roadside fence did not hold, namely the 8-meter gap. That is therefore where Ian placed his shield wall. The men in the wall were mostly young and fit, the ones who did not own a gun. As described before, they were armed with homemade shields and spears, except for the few like Ian, who had large axes, daggers, or swords. The shield wall was 3 men deep, with a handful of archers and spear throwers behind it, to thin out attackers, or deal with ones who managed to climb over the shield wall. Spurred on by the horrors witnesses had told them about the enemy, they had been training hard for 4 months, in addition to all their other duties on the mountain. As Ian had foreseen, the survival of their community, for the perilous half-hour of waiting to see if Project Ethelflade would work, would hang on these men. If Charlie failed at the main barrier in the road, none of this would matter, and their story would end today, in the most horrible way. Then the weakest part of the fence gave way to the back part of the herd attacking it, by order of their leader. This relieved some pressure on the warriors amassed on the road, as a few hundred stormed the thicket, screaming frustration at the new obstruction. They looked maddened, like Viking berserkers, but they were also visibly weak from sickness, wounds, and malnourishment. And then they saw the gap in the thicket. "Lock shields," Ian ordered, and the ordeal begun. How long could they hold this 8-meter gap? "For our families, we are their last line of defense," he shouted as the wall of shields locked, the arrows flied overhead, and the men stood ready to stab, not slash, as they had been taught. And above all, protect your neighbor. Not as fit as his company around him, Ian still felt a surge of adrenaline and motivation. As long as the men around you stood their ground, he would fight to the death. He feared that their enemy would have even just one gun, because a shield is no match for that. But it sounded like all the guns were engaged at the main barrier, on the road. The rate of fire from the mountain reserve community audibly overpowered their enemy, but would that make up for being outnumbered by about 250 to 30,000? Then the bombs began exploding, and the screaming changed to animal-like shrieking. The battle was pitching. The bombs had to stop that truck and its storm ram. Ian knew they had bombs and ammunition for less than half an hour, but he was not even sure his shield wall could hold that long. The pressure of hundreds of the enemy pushing against the front line was immense, despite the enemy falling like flies to the disciplined stabbing rhythm of his men. The smell was overwhelming. The cannibals, and the pit sores on their mouths and cheeks confirmed that that was what they were, smelled like rotting meat, puke, and shit mixed together. Ian could not hear much from the middle of his own battle, but it sounded like their attackers had run out of ammunition at the barrier. The truck was silent, hopefully broken, but there was a thudding sound. No matter how many they killed, there would always be more coming from the endless herd, and it sounded like they were now thumping the storm ram manually against the barrier. "Come on, Charlie, time to pull the switch," he thought. The moment could be lost in any of a number ways. The leader could order an attack on the bottom barrier to escape the trap, the storm ram could break through, or his shield wall could break, exposing the rest of the community hiding on the mountain. Among them there was only one gun, his own revolver, wielded by Marius in charge of communication. His orders were to look after Sheila whatever happened. Then gunshots also rang out at the southern gate, which was far away from the main road. Their other exit had been discovered by the enemy. If their leader moved their assault to there, all would be lost. Was he wrong to think Charlie had the military experience to know when the moment arrived? Or maybe tragedy had struck Charlie himself. Then there was a loud whoomp sound from the road, like a giant candle bursting to light. In fact, he could see the light change for a moment. The smell of fuel changed to the smell of burning fuel. The screaming pitched higher. "Charlie!" Ian knew what had happened. He shouted, "Hold the line, it's almost over." The line was wavering under immense pressure. The enemy had found some sharp sticks, were stabbing back, wounding his men. The mound of dead or wounded enemies was becoming a threat. Enemies could climb it and jump over his line from the top. Very soon this would be over, one way or the other. But he had a final card up his sleeve, and the moment had come to play it, just like Charlie had played his at the main barrier on the road. Ian shouted, "Molotov!" To be continued in episode 23. The Apophis Asteroid Apocalypse Episode 23, Game Over, by J.M. Conradi. Fire engulfed the main road where the main battle was. Their whole inventory of gasoline had been placed there as the final booby trap, and Charlie had ignited it at precisely the right moment. Flammable material, looking like normal debris, had also been spread all over the road. The cannibal army, as they would later call it, also had flammable material, and hell ensued. Due to the flaming inferno and the barriers trapping them, the enemy naturally wanted to flee toward Ian, and his shield wall, through the broken fence. When he shouted, "Molotov!" his archers lit their Molotov cocktails, and threw them over the shield wall into the middle of the gap in the thicket. His first aid team stood by with fire extinguishers just in case, and were already treating a few wounded soldiers. The shield wall was in danger of crumbling. Two of the burning Molotovs, a bottle filled with gasoline with a lit fuse, hit the target. A large flat bag full of fuel had been buried under some debris in the gap, as far away from the thicket as possible. Burning down the mountain reserve would not be a good idea. Just in case the flames did not reach the gasoline, a few pipes were buried leading from above the cover, down to the bag. It exploded. Just as they had practiced, the whole area under the attackers burst to flame. Their front line was trapped between the fire and the shield wall. Their rearguard, and any who tried to flee the fire on the road, were faced by a wall of flame. Then Ian observed a curious thing, later confirmed by Charlie, having lost all humanity since the apocalypse, living a life not really worthy of living, and used to easily trample everyone in their way, the cannibal horde which they called the herd, just gave up. Almost like self-immolation, they just stood there and let flames engulf them. A few hundred in the rearguard at the bottom of the hill broke through the temporary barrier there, and vanished into the fast approaching dusk of the poorly lit post-apocalyptic landscape. Many asked why they were not pursued, but Charlie said he did not have enough soldiers to risk it. Their main raiding party had already been used as bait that day, and the council had no more appetite for it. They would rather continue maintaining security, and clearing up the mess of the war, would take all the manpower they had, in addition to preparing for the demands of the months ahead. It was over. The threat to their existence had for now been neutralized. In this area, the Mountain Reserve community were now probably the strongest party. They also had to watch their ammunition, all provisions had been exhausted by the battle, and raiding parties on foot or bicycle would have to scavenge further and further away, for fuel and other resources. The victory was overwhelming, people were in awe of what Charlie and Ian had accomplished, but the price paid is also overwhelming. Several wounded had to be attended, and 5 soldiers would have to be buried, including a young man named Wolf, of the Shield Wall, a name the community would in future cling to as inspirational hero. In addition, of course, to the villain hero Ian. Mad but effective, some said. Sheila the Unifier had a slightly easier job then, to convince every corner of the Mountain Reserve community, to cooperate on security issues, and even listen to advice on prepping for 2030. To be continued in episode 24. The Apophis Asteroid Apocalypse Episode 24, Aftermath of War, Rekindling of Hope, by J.M. Conradi. With all his experience and reading about battlefields, nothing could have prepared Charlie for what he saw that day. He stood among his soldiers, on top of the main barricade on the main road, looking down when it was over. This is what he saw.
A battlefield, he thought. Memories of photos of the dead at Gettysburg, bodies lying in the surf at Tarawa, the dead and wounded Marines aboard a tank at Hue. Always photos, but never in a photograph was there the stench. The battlefield stank not just of cordite, but also the coppery smell of blood, feces, urine, vomit, the smell of open raw meat. But this raw meat was human, or once human. Mixed in, the smell of vehicles burning, gasoline, rubber, oil, and horrifying, burning bodies, roasting, bloating, bursting open as they fried.
In the underground bunker of the federal government of the USA, peace had been made. The lawyers had come up with a document that both parties, the president and the challengers led by the speaker, could agree to. A clear road map had been detailed, of how to proceed toward an election in a few months, how to restore communications and other processes, how to restart the economy, and how to prepare to re-establish centralized power, for whoever won the vote among survivors of the former republic. The blast doors separating the two groups were opened, hands were shook, and they prepared to open the outside doors and walk triumphantly, back into the glorious United States of America. Then the great moment arrived, and despite some jamming of signals ascribed to the devastating effect of the apocalypse, their soldiers and agents numbering almost 200 heavily armed personnel, opened the outside blast doors. The road was prepared, for DC politicians, and their staff and lawyers and elitist associates including media bosses and scientists, to walk out and reintroduce their self-profitable version of civilization outside. In the many months since Apophis, warlords had been fighting for control of the post-apocalyptic United States. 2 of them, former friends, both of them generals commanding powerful armed forces with many resources, had come out victorious and agreed to a split land between North and South. Then they had discovered where the remnants of government were hiding underground, and they had silently listened to their broadcasts and attempts at communication and regulation. When DC elites and their small but heavily armed force arrogantly exited from their bunker, both generals were waiting for them. The battle was brief but ferocious. Weapons like these had not been seen for a while, and probably would not be manufactured again for years. When the smoke settled, the federal government of the USA was no more. The two warlords joined forces, to then obliterate all signs of any remnant of anything there. They burned the whole area to a crisp. Thereafter the two armies feasted together, and then went their separate ways, to resume their redevelopment of the northern states, and the southern states. Like elsewhere in the world, the balance of power had shifted, and was beginning to stabilize, in a completely new form. This time a new world was really new. But not really better, because it was still human. Far away from continental power struggles, one mountain reserve community set about the complicated task of building a kind of future that would be livable. Raiding parties found less and less provisions. They had to produce more food themselves, garner sustainable resources like sunlight and rain. They had to keep an eye and an ear by shortwave radio, on events that could affect them. So began the next phase of the apocalypse, long-term survival. Most nights Ian, Sheila, Marius, and Biff sat together in front of their tents, after a subdued mess tent dinner, sharing their day in muted tones, and thinking and planning. Not many families were this fortunate, but big challenges and dangers still lay ahead. Now and then Biff was absent, for he had a new romantic interest in the northern half of the community. Life goes on, even post-apocalypse, as long as you survive. Survival is key, woke is forgotten. To be continued in episode 25, which will take a long time to record. Please be patient. 2029 is coming near, I know.
Asteroid Apophis.
Revelation 8, verse 10. Then the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch.
Asteroid Apophis. Asteroid Apophis. Asteroid Apophis.